You know what's strange? We've turned generations into punchlines. Boomers are the villains, Gen Z are the revolution, Gen Alpha are the mystery. But Generation Y? Millennials? They're the generation that lived through the transition from one world to another and got stuck paying the bill for it. Born roughly between 1981 and 1996, they're the people who remembered dial-up internet, who burned CDs with songs they downloaded overnight, who learned to type on chunky keyboards in school computer labs. They're the generation that grew up being told, you can be anything, and then discovered adulthood quietly added a second sentence, as long as you can afford it. And that contradiction rewired an entire generation. Picture this. It's 1999. You're a teenager, and the future feels clean. The Cold War is over. The internet is booming. Adults are obsessed with the new economy. You're told to pick a dream job, pick a major, build a resume, and everything will click into place. And then you blink, and it's 2008. Your older siblings are graduating into the Great Recession. Suddenly, entry-level jobs require experience. A degree isn't a ticket anymore. It's a debt contract. And here's the psychological consequence. When a generation is told a path is safe, and then that path collapses, it doesn't just create stress, it creates expectation violation. That's the mechanism. Not life is hard, but promise, investment, betrayal, nervous system recalibration. And that's why millennials don't trust stability. Not because they're dramatic, because they watched stability disappear twice. The first time was emotional. The second time was financial. Millennials were the first generation raised inside what researchers call intensive parenting, the era of scheduled playdates, constant supervision, trophy culture, your special messaging, after-school activities that filled every empty hour. They weren't raised to be independent, they were raised to be optimized. And when you grow up optimized, you don't develop a personality first, you develop a performance. Millennials were trained early to be impressive. Good grades, good extracurriculars, good colleges, good internships. And that creates a specific psychological trait, external validation dependence. Not because millennials are needy, because they were conditioned to treat approval like oxygen. Now, connect that to the internet. Millennials didn't grow up with social media as toddlers. They grew up with it as teenagers, which is worse, because they remember a world before the audience, and then got handed an audience right when identity was forming. MySpace, Facebook, Instagram. By the time millennials were in college, your social life had a scoreboard. And here's the mechanism. Social comparison didn't become a habit, it became infrastructure. Leon Festinger's research on social comparison is old, but millennials were the first generation to live inside it 24/7. They weren't comparing themselves to neighbors, they were comparing themselves to the most edited version of everyone. And this is where the first contradiction appears. Millennials are incredibly self-aware, and yet constantly unsure. They can name every trauma response, they can explain attachment styles, they can describe anxiety in clinical language, but they still struggle to feel grounded. Because self-awareness doesn't create safety, stability creates safety. And millennials grew up in a world where stability was always conditional. Now let's talk about the defining historical forces. Millennials were children when 9/11 happened, and that matters psychologically, because 9/11 didn't just change foreign policy, it changed the atmosphere. It turned the future from optimistic into uncertain. It introduced a constant background sense of threat. Airports changed, news changed, adults changed. The message became, something can happen anytime. And when your nervous system absorbs that during childhood, you don't become fearless, you become vigilant. Then came the second blow, 2008. The Great Recession didn't just hurt millennials financially, it changed how they relate to adulthood. A generation watched their parents lose jobs, their older siblings move back home, entire career paths disappear, housing become unreachable, hard work stop working. And here's what happens psychologically when that repeats. You stop believing in linear progress. You start believing in contingency. In other words, I'll build a plan, but I need an escape route. That's why millennials became the generation of side hustles. Not because they're entrepreneurial, because they're risk managed. And this leads to another contradiction. Millennials hate hustle culture, but they live inside it. They mock it, but they can't stop doing it, because hustle culture wasn't just a trend, it was a survival response to economic unpredictability. That's the system, not vibes. Now let's talk about work. Gen X respected competence over titles. Millennials respect meaning over hierarchy. But here's the trade-off. Meaning-based work is psychologically expensive, because when you need your job to feel meaningful, you also feel personally attacked when work is toxic. Boomers could hate their job and still feel like adults. Millennials often feel like, if my job is draining me, maybe I'm failing as a person. That's why burnout became a millennial signature. Not because they're fragile, because their identity and work became fused. Christina Maslach's burnout framework explains this well. Emotional exhaustion, cynicism, reduced efficacy. Millennials didn't invent burnout. They just became the first generation to normalize talking about it while still being forced to function inside it. Now, here's a detail that explains a lot. Millennials are the generation that grew up during the shift from cash to cards. They remember counting coins at the counter. They remember when broke was physical. You could see it. Now, broke is invisible. It's a number on a screen, a credit score, a debt balance. And when money becomes abstract, anxiety becomes constant. Because you can't feel when you're safe, you can only check. And checking becomes a habit. Bank apps, budgeting apps, credit score apps. That's not financial literacy, that's nervous system management. Now let's talk about relationships. Millennials were raised on romance stories and then introduced to dating apps. They were told love is fate and then taught love is a marketplace. Swipe culture didn't just change dating, it changed attachment. Because when you can replace someone instantly, people become disposable. And millennials experienced this at the exact moment they were trying to build stable adult relationships. So you get another contradiction. They want deep connection, but they don't trust it. They want commitment, but they fear wasting time. They crave stability, but they expect collapse. And this is where millennial humor comes in. The memes, the self-deprecating jokes, the "I'm tired" identity, the "I can't afford a house" punchlines. The reason it's so common isn't because millennials are childish, it's because humor is how you turn helplessness into control. If you can laugh at it, it hurts a little less. Comedy becomes a psychological shield, the same way Gen X used irony. Millennials just turned it into memes. Now, let's acknowledge the trade-offs, because this is where the analysis becomes honest. Millennials didn't just lose things, they gained things too. They became the most emotionally literate generation. They normalized therapy. They popularized mental health language. They questioned toxic parenting. They built the vocabulary that younger generations now use casually. They weren't raised in silence. They were raised in analysis. But here's the cost. When you grow up analyzing yourself, you can become trapped inside your own mind. Millennials often don't feel their emotions. They narrate them. They don't experience life. They optimize it. And optimization is exhausting because there is no finish line. So what is the core millennial psychology? It's this. Millennials were raised for a future that didn't arrive. They were trained to perform in a system that kept moving the goalpost. They didn't become anxious because they're weak. They became anxious because they learned that rules change, systems fail, Stability is contingent, and adulthood is not guaranteed. And yet, they still built lives. They still showed up. They still adapted. Millennials are the first generation that learned how to live publicly while suffering privately. They're the first generation that turned self-awareness into a survival skill. They're not better than other generations, just different, shaped by a world that promised progress and delivered uncertainty. And maybe that's why they seem so tired. Not because they can't handle life, because they've been handling it non-stop since the moment the future stopped feeling safe. If this hit home for you, subscribe. And if you want the psychology of Gen Z and why they seem emotionally intense and chronically overstimulated, the next video is going to hit even harder than this one.